The snow was already past my ankles when Constance Whitmore threw my coat at my feet like it was garbage. "Don't touch my porch," she said. "Take your babies and get out." I bent down as fast as I could, a newborn cradled against my chest, and yanked the coat around my shoulders with my free hand. I didn't even get it zipped. My boots, the ones I kept by the door for quick trips to the mailbox, were still half-laced when I shoved my feet into them, my hands too full and too shaky to manage the rest. It wasn't enough. Not against a night that cold. Not against wind that cut straight through an open coat and unlaced boots. But it was more than nothing. And in that moment, more than nothing was all I had time to grab. Constance's voice cracked through the freezing air, sharp enough to wake the twins in my arms. Eloan started crying first, her tiny face scrunched red against the cold. Ezra followed a second later, his cry thinner, weaker, 10 days old, and already learning the world could turn on you without warning. I stood on the frozen driveway of the house I'd lived in for 2 years, holding 2 newborns against my chest, my coat hanging open over thin nursing gown, boots filling with snow, and I watched my husband close the front door behind his mother without once looking back at me. Dalton didn't even flinch. That's the part that still sits wrong in my chest. Not the cold. Not Constance's screaming. It was watching the man I married stand in the doorway of our home, warm light spilling out behind him, and choose to let the door shut on his own children, like we were something he'd already thrown away days ago. They thought I had nowhere else to go. They thought I was a struggling freelance designer, dependent on the Pierce family for every diaper, every meal, every breath of stability I had left. They had no idea who they were really standing in front of. And by the time this story ends, neither of them will ever forget it. My name is Brier Callahan. 10 days before that night in the snow, I gave birth to twins in a hospital room where my husband checked his phone 43 times during 11 hours of labor. I counted. When your body is tearing itself open to bring 2 lives into the world, counting is the only thing that keeps your mind from splitting apart with the pain. 43 times. A nurse held my hand because he wasn't holding it. I told myself it was stress. New father nerves. I told myself a lot of things in those years, because that's what you do when your entire adult life is built on a story you need to be true. Here's the story you need to understand first, because none of what happened later makes sense without it. 3 years earlier, I met Dalton Pierce at a charity gala in Chicago. I was there representing a boutique design firm, at least, that's what my business card said. What it didn't say was that the firm was mine. I'd built it from nothing, starting with hand-drawn sketches sold out of a rented studio apartment when I was 24, growing it into a name whispered about in rooms I wasn't even in. I designed under a professional alias, Wren Ashford, a name I'd invented back when I was terrified that if people knew a woman in her 20s with no architecture degree was behind the work, they'd stop taking me seriously. The alias became armor. Nobody in Dalton's world ever connected quiet, thrift blazer Brier Callahan to Wren Ashford, the designer with an 18-month waitlist. I never lied about my success. I simply never advertised it. There's a difference, even if the Pierce family would spend 3 years refusing to see it. Growing up, money had always been a source of quiet humiliation in my house. My mother cleaned offices at night and sewed alterations by day after my father left. I remembered, with a clarity that never faded, the way certain relatives looked at her second-hand coat, her worn shoes, the careful way she counted change at the grocery store. I promised myself young that I'd build something so solid nobody could ever look at me that way again. I just never imagined that the success I built would become the very thing I hid from the man I married, because some old wound in me still equated being loved with being wanted regardless of what I had. That wound is exactly what the Pierce family found and pressed on, again and again, without ever knowing they were doing it. Dalton was charming that night, attentive in a way that felt like sunlight after years of cold client meetings. He listened. He made me laugh so hard a caterer asked us to quiet down. I fell for him slowly, the way you fall into a warm bath without noticing the water rising past your shoulders. I didn't correct him when he assumed my modest wardrobe meant modest earnings. I didn't mention that my little design gig was actually a company with 12 employees and clients whose homes had elevators. Some small, quiet part of me liked being loved without my success attached to it. I wanted to know if Dalton Pierce would choose me even if I had nothing. I got my answer. It just took 3 years and 2 newborns to arrive. Constance never liked me. That was obvious from our first dinner, when she looked at my department store dress and said, loud enough for the whole table to hear, "Well, Dalton certainly doesn't choose women for their bank accounts, does he?" I laughed it off then. I laugh a lot less about it now. Constance ran the Pierce family like a corporation, with herself as permanent chairwoman. Dalton's late father had left behind a modest fortune and a struggling boutique hospitality business. 3 small inns, scattered across 2 states, that Constance had been keeping afloat for a decade through sheer stubbornness and increasingly desperate loans. She adored appearances. She adored control. And within the first month of meeting me, she'd decided I was a woman marrying up, someone to be managed, watched, and eventually removed once I'd served whatever purpose she imagined I served. I didn't fight her for a place in that family. I simply built my life quietly alongside theirs, working from a converted sunroom in the house Dalton and I bought together, a house listed under both our names, though I'd contributed nearly 70% of the down payment using savings I never disclosed. Dalton knew I had money saved. He never asked how much. I never told him. Looking back, that silence wasn't intimacy. It was 2 people building a marriage on separate, unshared truths, and truths that go unshared long enough eventually curdle into something else entirely. The pregnancy was hard. Twins are hard on anybody, and mine fought me through all 36 weeks. Dalton grew distant almost the moment the second line appeared on the test. I told myself it was fear. I made excuses for the late nights, for the phone he started keeping face down on every surface, for the way he stopped reaching for me in bed months before I ever got too big to be held. There were smaller signs too, the kind you only recognize clearly once you're forced to look back at them under a harsher light. He stopped asking how the baby names were coming along around month 5. He stopped putting his hand on my stomach at night, feeling for a kick. He started coming home later, always with a reasonable explanation. A client dinner. A deadline. A colleague's send-off. I believed him every time, because believing him was easier than sitting with the alternative. I should have paid closer attention to a woman named Sabrina Voss, a marketing associate at Dalton's firm with a laugh that carried across open-plan offices and a habit of just checking in with my husband on weekends while I was elbow-deep in nursery paint and third trimester exhaustion. I met her twice. Both times, Dalton introduced her the same overly casual way. "This is Sabrina. She's on my team." The kind of introduction a man rehearses until it sounds casual enough. I didn't know yet. I want to be honest about that. This isn't a story where I was some brilliant detective piecing together clues from the start. I was a very pregnant, very tired woman trying to build a nursery and run a company from a laptop balanced on my swollen knees. I missed things. Or maybe some part of me chose not to look too closely, the way you avoid touching a bruise because you already know how much it will hurt. The twins came 3 days early, in the middle of a Tuesday snowstorm. 11 hours of labor left me hollowed out and stitched together, holding 2 impossibly small humans who were, for one exhausted, tear-soaked moment, the only thing that mattered in the world. Ezra came first, quiet and watchful even as a newborn. Eloan followed 4 minutes later, already furious at the cold hospital air, her cry filling the room so fiercely a nurse laughed and said she'd be running the household by age 3. Dalton held them both. He cried, actually cried. And for a moment, I let myself believe that whatever distance had grown between us over the pregnancy would close now that our children were here, breathing, real. I was wrong. It closed for exactly 10 days. 10 days is barely enough time for a newborn's umbilical stump to fall away. Barely enough time for a mother's body to remember how to survive on broken sleep. It was, apparently, exactly enough time for Dalton and his mother to finish planning what came next. I noticed the shift on day 7. Constance started arriving daily, always with some excuse, soup, checking on her grandbabies, lingering in the kitchen with Dalton in hushed conversations that stopped the second I walked in. I chalked it up to grandmother enthusiasm and new parent paranoia. On day 9, I found a text on the shared family tablet we used for grocery lists, a message from Sabrina to Dalton that had synced across devices by some careless setting neither of us had thought to check. It wasn't explicit. It didn't need to be. Almost there. Once she's out, we can finally stop hiding this. I read it standing in the nursery at 4 in the morning, Eloan asleep against my shoulder, my whole body suddenly colder than the room actually was. Once she's out. Out of what? I didn't yet fully understand. I assumed, in my sleep-deprived panic, that it meant out of the marriage. I had no idea how literal that phrase was about to become. I need you to sit with that for a second, because everything after this point moves fast, and once it starts, it doesn't stop. I confronted Dalton the next morning, quietly, exhausted, holding Ezra while he fed from a bottle because my body had nothing left to give. I asked him directly who Sabrina was to him. He didn't deny it the way a guilty, repentant man might. He didn't crumble or beg forgiveness. He looked at me with something close to relief, like I'd finally said out loud what he'd been too much of a coward to say himself. "This isn't working, Brier," he said. "It hasn't for a long time. I think it's better if we're honest about that now, before things get more complicated." More complicated, as if 2 10-day-old infants weren't already the most complicated, precious thing either of us would ever be responsible for. I want to tell you I fought back in that moment with fire and fury. The truth is, I sat in stunned silence, holding our son, while my husband calmly explained that he and Sabrina had been involved for the better part of a year, that he'd planned to tell me once things settled, and that his mother agreed it would be best if I took some time to figure things out somewhere else. Somewhere else. As if a woman 10 days postpartum with 2 newborns simply had a backup home waiting in the wings. They assumed I didn't. That was their first mistake. Constance arrived at 6 that evening, ostensibly to help with the babies, though I understood by then her visits had never really been about the twins. She swept through the front door like a woman who'd been waiting for this moment. "We need to talk, Brier," she said, settling onto the couch like she owned the house, which, to be fair to her assumptions, she believed she practically did, since it had never once occurred to her that anyone but Dalton could have paid for it. "This arrangement clearly isn't sustainable." I asked what arrangement she meant, though I already knew. "You and Dalton," she said, waving a hand as though our marriage were an inconvenient piece of furniture. "It's not working. Everyone can see that. Frankly, dear, it would be better for the children to have stability now rather than growing up in a house full of tension." I held Eloan a little tighter and asked, very simply, where exactly she thought I was supposed to take that stability, since I had no family in the state, no income she was aware of, and 2 infants who needed round-the-clock care. Constance smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. "You'll figure something out. You always do, don't you? Working from that little sunroom of yours. You've clearly gotten by before Dalton. I'm sure you'll manage." The way she said little made my skin crawl. I looked at Dalton, standing near the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, saying nothing. Not defending me. Not defending our children's right to a stable home their mother had built with her own money. Just standing there, letting his mother do the work of ending my marriage for him. The same way he'd let a nurse hold my hand during labor while he checked his phone. That was the moment I understood something had shifted permanently between all 3 of us. And it kept shifting, fast, until it reached a point none of us could take back. It happened just before 9 that night. I'd gone upstairs to feed the twins, exhausted past the point of coherent thought, when I heard raised voices below, Constance's clipped, furious tone cutting through the floorboards, Dalton's lower voice occasionally trying and failing to interrupt her. When I came back down, Ezra finally asleep against my chest, Eloan fussing in my other arm. Constance was standing by the front door holding my coat, my hospital discharge bag, and a stack of baby items. She'd packed it herself while I was upstairs. "I think it's best you go stay somewhere tonight," she said. "Clear your head. Let Dalton and I sort out the practical details." I told her I wasn't leaving my home at 9 at night with 2 newborns in the middle of a snowstorm. That's when her voice broke into the scream that started this whole story. "Take your babies and get out." I looked at Dalton. I actually looked directly at him, waiting, genuinely waiting, some small foolish part of me still hoping he'd step forward and tell his mother to stop. Tell me to sit down. Acknowledge that whatever had broken between us didn't mean our children deserved to be thrown into a snowstorm. He didn't move. He looked at the floor. And then he opened the front door himself. I don't remember deciding to walk through it. I remember the cold hitting my face first, sharper than anything I'd felt in years. I remember the sound of the door closing behind me, the click of the lock turning, the warm light disappearing behind frosted glass, while I stood on a driveway holding 2 crying infants, my unzipped coat doing nothing against a wind that found every gap in it. For a few seconds I couldn't move at all. My body was still recovering from labor, every stitch inside me screaming with the effort of standing upright, and the wind cut through the thin cotton of my gown like it had personal business with my bones. Eloan's cry rose into something raw and frantic. I pressed my lips to the top of her head and whispered the only thing I could think to say, over and over, half to her and half to myself. "We're okay. We're okay. We're okay." I didn't believe it yet. I said it anyway, because a newborn can't hear despair, and a mother can't afford to let it show, even when despair is the only honest thing in her chest. I looked back once at the house, the porch light glowing gold against the snow, Dalton's shadow retreating from the window, and something inside me went very quiet and very still. The way water goes still right before it freezes solid. They thought this was the end of something for me. They had absolutely no idea it was the beginning. I didn't call a shelter that night. I didn't call a friend to come rescue me, sobbing on their doorstep. I did something Constance and Dalton never once imagined I was capable of, because they'd spent 3 years deciding I was a woman with nothing behind her name. I called my company's emergency driver line. Within 11 minutes, a black SUV pulled into that driveway. My assistant, Marisol, already had a hotel room booked and heated bottles ready by the time I arrived, because I'd texted her the second I stepped off that porch. She didn't ask a single question before she started making calls. I want to be clear about something. I was never broke. I was never without options. I had simply spent 3 years choosing not to reveal the full truth of who I was, because I wanted a marriage where I wasn't valued for a bank balance. That choice had cost me the ability to be seen clearly by the 2 people who were about to learn exactly who they'd thrown into the snow, and what happens in the next few minutes is going to change everything for both of them. By midnight, wrapped in a hotel robe with both twins finally settled and sleeping in a hospital-grade bassinet my company kept on standby for exactly this kind of emergency, I opened my laptop and did the one thing I'd avoided doing for 3 years. I told the truth. The first call went to my lawyer, Brier Callahan, sharp, unflappable, and my company's counsel since the beginning. I laid out everything. The house. The down payment records under my real name. The marriage. The affair. The scream in the snow. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said something I'll never forget. "Brier, you own 70% equity in that house through documented transfers. You have 3 years of bank statements proving independent income exceeding anything Dalton has ever earned. And you have a text message admitting to premeditated infidelity, timed around your childbirth. This isn't complicated. This is going to be very, very clean." The second call went to my PR director, Odessa Marsh, young, ferociously loyal, and someone who'd been begging me for 2 years to let the industry know that Ren Ashford and Brier Callahan were the same person. "It's a story, Brier," she'd said more than once. "A good one. People love finding out the quiet woman in the corner is actually the one running the room." That night, for the first time, I told her to run it. I want to be honest about my own motivations here, because revenge stories are more satisfying when they're rooted in something real. I wasn't doing this to destroy Dalton for the sake of destruction. I was doing it because I finally understood that hiding my success had never protected my marriage. It had only protected Dalton and Constance's ability to underestimate me. And underestimation, I was learning fast, is a very dangerous thing to hand people who already think poorly of you. There was a practical side too, one I didn't appreciate until Odessa raised it. Any firm my size runs a standing conflict of interest review whenever a founder's name becomes publicly tied to legal trouble. Odessa's team pulled our active contract list within the week, cross-referencing every client against the Pierce name out of standard caution. That's how we found it. Constance's business manager had signed with my firm nearly a year earlier through a routine referral. Nobody on my end had made the connection, because I never personally reviewed client rosters at that scale, and Constance had never once asked who was actually behind the firm's name. The following weeks moved with a momentum I hadn't expected. Odessa's carefully placed feature ran in a design industry publication with wide reach. The quiet, publicity-shy founder behind some of the most sought-after residential interiors on the East Coast finally had a name, a face, and a story about surviving a winter night that involved being locked out of her own home. The piece didn't name Dalton or Constance directly. It didn't need to. Anyone in their social circle who read it understood exactly who the estranged husband and controlling mother-in-law were. Brier moved on the legal front too. Quickly, though in family court, quickly still meant weeks, not days. Within 4 days, she secured an emergency temporary order granting me exclusive use of the home. Courts move fast when infants are involved and a parent has documentation showing they were removed from a residence without safety arranged. It wasn't a final ruling, but it bought me the house and the twins stability while the case unfolded. Nearly 2 months of filings, financial disclosures, and one deposition where Dalton's own words from that night were read back to him by Brier, slowly, twice. Because the deed reflected my financial contribution far more heavily than his, and because the courts take a firm view on primary caregivers of infants being unlawfully removed from a shared residence, the temporary order held through the full proceedings and eventually became permanent. Dalton fought it briefly, with the kind of energy men display when they've never once had to fight for anything in their lives and don't know how to sustain it. His lawyer argued the house was marital property. Brier calmly produced 3 years of wire transfer records showing my independent contribution, alongside a forensic accountant's report showing that during the same period, Dalton's contributions to household expenses had steadily declined while unexplained withdrawals, later traced to an apartment leased under Sabrina Voss's name, had steadily increased. The affair, once merely implied, surfaced gradually through those same financial filings, then in Sabrina's own deposition, until it existed permanently in the case record, whether anyone wanted it there or not. Constance's reaction to all of this tells you everything about who she really was underneath the polish she'd spent a decade curating. She didn't apologize. She didn't soften. Instead, she tried to rally what remained of the family's social circle against me, telling anyone who'd listen that I'd manipulated my way into their family, that I'd hidden my wealth like a con artist working an angle. She miscalculated badly. By then, the story circulating wasn't about a con artist. It was about a mother pushed into the snow with newborn twins by a husband's betrayal and a mother-in-law's cruelty. And design clients, it turns out, care deeply about the character of the person redesigning their million-dollar homes. 3 of Constance's own hospitality properties, the inns she'd spent a decade struggling to keep solvent, had recently signed with my firm for a planned renovation meant to save the failing business. The same contracts Odessa's team had flagged during their review. I let my legal team quietly exercise the contract's standard morality clause the week the affair became part of the public case record. The renovation contracts were terminated. Constance's inns, already drowning in debt, lost the exact financial lifeline that project represented. I didn't gloat. I didn't send a single message. I simply let the paperwork speak the way she had once let a slammed door speak for her. None of this came without cost, and it's important to say that plainly rather than let this sound like a clean victory lap. Some of Dalton's extended family sided with him publicly, calling me calculating for going public at all. A handful of prospective clients quietly backed away, worried about privacy by association. Legal fees ran high enough that I dipped into savings I'd built for years without touching. And there were nights, plenty of them, when I sat awake with a crying infant on each side of me and felt nothing like a woman winning anything. Just a woman surviving one more exhausting hour of a fight she never asked to be in. The custody arrangement, when it finally settled, gave me primary residence with the twins. Dalton's visitation started fully supervised, not designed as punishment, Brier explained, but as a standard response whenever a court sees this much instability and this little established routine between a father and infants in their earliest weeks. It certainly felt like consequence anyway. Over the following year, as Dalton showed up consistently and completed the court-required parenting classes, the supervision gradually lifted. I won't pretend that didn't complicate the clean ending I might have wanted. Co-parenting with a man who broke your family apart is its own particular kind of exhausting, one that doesn't end just because the court case does. I moved back into the house in early spring. The same driveway where I'd once stood freezing with 2 newborns was now edged with the first stubborn crocuses pushing up through the last of the snow. I stood there for a long moment on the day I got the keys back, Ezra strapped to my chest, Eloan napping in her stroller, and I finally let myself cry. Not from grief this time. From something closer to relief. Dalton reached out eventually, months later, in a message that read more like a man mourning what he'd lost than a man who understood why he'd lost it. He wrote that he never expected things to go this far. That he hadn't realized how much he'd taken for granted. I didn't respond with anger. I responded with 4 words that felt truer than anything I could have shouted at him on that porch. You had every warning. He tried once more, weeks later, showing up unannounced outside the office where I now worked openly under my own name. No alias left to hide behind. He stood in the parking lot looking smaller than I remembered him ever being, and he asked quietly why I never told him the truth about who I was from the beginning. I thought about that question for a long moment before answering, because it deserved an honest response rather than a cutting one. I told you exactly who I was, Dalton, I said. You just decided a woman without much money was easier to love than a woman who didn't need you to survive. That was never my secret to carry. That was yours. He didn't have an answer for that. I don't think he ever will. Sabrina and Dalton's relationship, from what I understand through the small, unavoidable overlap our lives still share because of the twins, didn't survive the fallout either. It's a strange thing, watching a relationship built on secrecy discover that secrecy doesn't disappear once it's served its purpose. It just gets redirected toward whoever's convenient to blame next. Constance never apologized. I've stopped waiting for her to. Some people are constitutionally incapable of admitting that the driveway they built with their own hands was the one that eventually buried them. I heard, through the thin grapevine that still connects our lives, that Constance eventually had to sell one of her 3 inns to cover the debt left behind once my firm's contract dissolved, and restructure financing on the other 2 just to keep them from following it. She kept the business alive. Technically. But according to that same grapevine, her health started declining under the stress of watching a decade of careful appearances collapse in the span of a single season. I felt something when I heard that, though it wasn't triumph. It was closer to the quiet, sober satisfaction of watching consequence finally arrive at a door that had spent years believing it was exempt from ever answering for anything, even knowing that consequence, like most of it, arrives messy and incomplete rather than as some tidy final punishment. I didn't call her. I didn't send flowers, and I didn't send judgment either. I simply let her situation exist the way mine had once been forced to exist on that driveway. Unsheltered, unassisted, entirely hers to survive. These days, my sunroom studio has expanded into a full office on the other side of the house. Walls covered in fabric samples and blueprints, my 2 children old enough now to toddle between drafting tables while Marisol tries valiantly to keep them from eating swatches of raw silk. Ezra is quiet and watchful, just like he was the moment he was born. Eloan still announces her opinions to the entire household the second something displeases her, and I have never once tried to tame that fire out of her. Some evenings, after both twins are bathed, fed, and settled into heavy, boneless sleep, I sit alone in the sunroom where the second chapter of my life first took root, and I let myself simply breathe. The house is quiet in a way it never was during those last strained months with Dalton. That old quiet was the sound of a woman shrinking herself to fit inside someone else's comfort. This quiet is the sound of a woman who finally stopped apologizing for the size of the life she built. I think about that night often, not with the sharp sting it once carried, but with a strange kind of clarity. Constance and Dalton looked at a woman holding 2 newborns in the snow and saw someone with nothing. They saw someone they could discard without consequence, because they'd already decided, long before that night, exactly how little I was worth. They were wrong about almost everything that mattered. And the ground they pushed me into that night turned out to be exactly where I finally planted something strong enough to outlast every single thing they thought they were protecting. So here's what I keep coming back to, and what I want to ask you directly, because I think it says something true about how easily people mistake quiet for weak and modest for empty. If someone you loved decided you had nothing left to lose, would you let them believe that? Or would you show them exactly how wrong they were?